They were explorers, campers, and travelers, adventurers drawn to the beauty and thrill of the great outdoors. But the wilderness turned against them in a heartbeat, transforming their passion into pure terror. These are some of the most chilling and tragic survival stories ever told, where nature's unforgiving power shattered dreams and turned ordinary journeys into haunting cautionary tales. On the crisp morning of March 3rd, 2025, breakfast was in full swing at the prestigious Golden Tiger Hotel, one of Russia's finest retreats, perched at the edge of Primorye's vast, forested wilderness. Outside, towering pines stood like sentinels, their branches still kissed by the fading remnants of winter. Inside, the grand breakfast hall pulsed with life, the soft hum of conversation, the rhythmic chime of silverware against porcelain, and the intoxicating fusion of rich coffee, sizzling bacon, smoked fish, and golden fried eggs filling the air. Svetlana Orlova, a journalist from Vladivostok, sat near the buffet, sipping her tea as she scrolled through her phone, absently spearing a piece of bacon with her fork. Across from her, Mikhail Petrov, a businessman in his late 40s, checked his watch, his mind already occupied with the meetings he had scheduled for the day. Around them, guests lingered over their meals, enjoying the warmth of the dining room while the cold wind howled just beyond the glass windows. It was no wonder that no one heard the first sign of danger. The faint creak of wood giving way, the slow splintering of a doorframe. It wasn't until the heavy crash of something massive breaking through the kitchen entrance echoed through the hotel that heads turned, confusion flickering across their faces. The sound of metal pans clattering to the floor added to the chaos, and then a deafening roar sent ice down the spines of every guest and worker in the hall. The kitchen door slammed open, and a monstrous shape lurched into the main entrance. It was a Russian grizzly bear, one of the most dangerous creatures on the planet. The animal was enormous, its black eyes, wild and unfocused, swept across the room as it bared yellowed teeth, its snout twitching with the scent of food. Nobody knew how to react at first. The first scream was what sent the bear charging. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests scrambled away from their tables, dishes smashing against the tiles as trays were overturned in blind panic. Svetlana shoved back from her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs as the bear swung its massive head in her direction. Before she could take a step, the beast lunged. A wall of fur, muscle, and raw power sent her crashing to the ground, her body pinned beneath the predator's weight. A hot burst of pain seared through her flesh as the bear's claws raked into her back. The bear's growl drowned a strangled gasp in her throat. Mikhail barely rose from his chair when the grizzly turned on him next. He tried to run, but the beast was faster. It slammed a paw into his chest, sending him sprawling onto the floor. The wind was knocked from his lungs as the bear descended upon him, massive jaws closing around his shoulder, crushing bone with a sickening crunch. Blood pooled beneath him, his body convulsing in agony as if gripped by seizures. Screaming guests shoved past one another. They were desperate to escape the carnage, but the bear, frenzied now, whirled around and looked for its next target. A group of 3 guests, led by an elderly man named Dmitry Ivanov, sprinted toward the restrooms, shoving inside and slamming the door shut just as the bear charged. They pressed themselves against the far wall, hearts pounding, hands clasped over their mouths to stifle terrified breaths. But the bear was relentless. It reared up on its hind legs and threw its full weight against the flimsy wooden door, the force rattling the walls, the hinges groaning under the strain. With a final splintering crack, the door gave way. The bear surged forward, its bulk filling the narrow space. Blood-slicked claws slashed at Dmitry, ripping into his side, the impact sending him crashing into the sinks. A second guest tried to crawl away, but the bear caught her by the leg, dragging her back as her fingers clawed uselessly at the floor. The last person in the room, a teenage boy, could do nothing but press himself into the corner, paralyzed with terror as the beast's snarling maw closed over his throat. The beast returned to the dining hall, where hotel staff had armed themselves with whatever they could find. Fire extinguishers, chairs, kitchen knives, but nothing deterred the rampaging predator. A cook aimed a blast of white foam at the bear's face, hoping to blind it, but the beast barely flinched. Outside, sirens wailed. The crazed and agitated bear prowled back through the dining area's wreckage, stepping over broken dishes and overturned tables, its breath ragged, its hunger unsatisfied. A shot rang out, shattering a window. The bear jerked its head up. Its nostrils flared in apprehension. A second shot tore through its shoulder, a burst of dark blood spraying against the tiled floor. The beast snarled, but another bullet struck true, piercing its skull. The massive form crumpled, collapsing. The silence that followed was deafening, the only sounds the panicked sobs of the survivors. the shallow gasps of those too injured to scream. Police officers stormed in, weapons raised, eyes wide as they took in the devastation. Bodies lay strewn across the floor, lifeless forms in pools of crimson. Survivors clung to one another, trembling, their eyes glazed with shock. The aftermath was a scene of horror. Broken furniture, smeared blood, and still bodies. Emergency responders worked frantically, checking pulses, calling names, searching for anyone still breathing. A total of 5 guests lost their lives in the attack. Later, as investigators examined the bear's remains, experts pointed to the warming temperatures and the early thaw disrupting the predator's hibernation cycle. Hunger and confusion had driven it from the depths of the forest into the heart of human civilization, where instinct had turned to violence. But for those who had witnessed the carnage firsthand, for the staff, who would never forget the sight of the dining hall transformed into a slaughterhouse, for the families who would never see their loved ones again, no explanation would ever be enough. The early morning stillness in Libby's small train station was broken only by the occasional hum of fluorescent lights. It was February 2025, and a thin layer of frost clung to the windows. The cold outside sharp enough to make breath fog in thick clouds. Inside, travelers stood in loose clusters, shifting on their feet, hands tucked into coats, waiting for the day's first train while sipping bad coffee and eating sandwiches from the vending machines. 34-year-old Emily Harris adjusted her scarf while holding her daughter Lily's small hand. The 6-year-old, bundled in a pink puffer jacket, yawned and rubbed her sleepy eyes. Emily had promised her daughter an adventure, a train ride to visit her grandparents across the state. She had checked their tickets 3 times, keeping them tucked in her coat pocket. Lily hummed quietly, swinging her legs as they waited, oblivious to the growing danger outside. Something stirred in the darkness beyond the station doors. It was a bear. A grizzly, as lean as it was massive. An incomplete hibernation had made it hungry and mad. The bear padded slowly across the icy pavement, its breath rising in thick clouds. The scents drifting from the station, food, warmth, life, drew it forward. It moved toward the entrance with no hesitation. Inside, the automatic doors slid open with a quiet hiss. A gust of cold air swept into the station as the bear entered. At first, no one reacted. A few people glanced up, expecting a late commuter rushing in from the cold. But heads turned when the heavy, deliberate footfalls echoed across the tile floor. Conversations faltered. The realization spread like a slow-moving shockwave. Emily turned at the sound of gasps and sharp cries. Her stomach lurched. The bear stood just beyond the entrance, its hulking frame blocking the exit. It lifted its massive head, nostrils flaring as it took in the scent of fresh food and terrified humans. The room held its breath. Then the bear stepped further inside the room, and mayhem ensued. Emily shoved Lily behind her as the beast barreled forward, knocking aside a row of chairs as easily as if they were toys. The impact came too fast to react. A wall of muscle and fur slammed into Emily. The force knocked the air from her lungs, her head snapping back against the hard tile. The bear's claws were everywhere, raking across her side, back, and legs. Lily briefly got caught in the attack. Before her mother pushed her away and screamed at her to get away, the bear's claws connected with her small shoulder, slicing it open. At her mother's command, Lily scrambled away. The girl's scream pierced the air as she watched her mother being mauled. Dazed, Emily tried to move and reassure her daughter, but the bear's weight pinned her down. Hot breath blasted against her face as the beast loomed over her. A flash of yellowed teeth made her blood turn icy in her veins, and then, as the bear let out a deep, agonizing roar, Emily realized she was going to die, and her beloved daughter was going to see everything. Claws tore into Emily's chest, slicing through flesh and leaving deep, gaping wounds. Jaws snapped down onto her shoulder, crushing bone with horrifying ease. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the tile, steaming against the cold air. She gasped, a ragged, broken sound, but her only thought was of Lily. The child was frozen, eyes wide with horror, her tiny hands clutched at the hem of her jacket. Tears streamed down her face, but she couldn't move. Around them, commuters bolted for cover, some diving behind benches, others sprinting toward the far end of the station, hoping to find safety. The ticket clerk had vanished, leaving the counter abandoned. The bear, consumed by instinct, paid no attention to anything else. Then a backpack flew through the air, striking the bear's head. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The animal flinched, momentarily distracted. Lily's cries filled the air as a pair of hands grabbed her, pulling her away. A man, face pale with fear, scooped her up and stumbled backward, shielding her with his body as he rushed toward the others. The bear shook itself, nostrils flaring, blood staining its muzzle. It looked up, its black eyes sweeping across the station. And then, gunfire rang out. The first shot hit the tiled floor, sending shards of ceramic flying and making commuters scream again. The second struck the bear's shoulder, a burst of red against thick fur. It let out a roar, rearing up on its hind legs, its massive form towering over the station's cowering travelers. Another shot rang out, and then another. The bear jerked back. Its breaths came in heavy, ragged gasps. The pain, the confusion, the loud noises, it was too much. It turned, staggering, before lurching back toward the entrance. The automatic doors opened again, and the beast stumbled into the cold, vanishing into the pre-dawn darkness. Inside the station, the silence was suffocating. Emily lay motionless in a growing pool of crimson. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps, her fingers twitching weakly. She tried to focus, tried to see past the blinding pain. She saw Lily. The girl's shoulder was bleeding, but she was safe. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she had no strength to speak. Then, she went still. By the time paramedics arrived, the floor was slick with blood, and the station reeked of fear. Lily clung to the man who had saved her. Her small hands balled into fists against his coat, oblivious to her physical pain. Her eyes were wide with shock, glued to her mother's lifeless body. Later, they found the bear's body deep in the trees, its wounds fatal. Officials determined it had been starving, its hibernation cycle disrupted. But those facts didn't matter to Lily. She would remember only the cold tile, the roar of the beast, and the sight of her mother's body broken beneath its claws. She would remember the moment the world changed forever. The morning that had begun with excitement and ended in terror. There would be no forgetting for Lily. It was an early afternoon on March 2nd, 2025, deep inside a remote forest outside Boulder, Colorado. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the towering evergreens swaying gently in the wind. High above the ground, Steve Williams moved with practiced precision, his harness secure around his waist as he maneuvered through the branches of a towering lodgepole pine. At 42, he had spent most of his life cutting trees, his body conditioned to the strain of long days spent at dizzying heights. Steve adjusted his footing, glancing down at the clearing below. His crew was scattered across the worksite, each man focused on his task. The whine of chainsaws echoed through the forest, sharp and relentless. Logs lay stacked neatly. Suddenly, Steve saw movement out of the corner of his eye. At first, the man thought it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light or a shadow shifting among the trees. But when he focused, he saw a black bear, large and dark, stepping cautiously into the clearing. Its head was low, ears twitching as it sniffed the air. Steve marveled at the sight. Black bears, he knew, were shy creatures afraid of noise and people. So why was this one coming closer to the noise instead of hiding away? Encounters with wildlife weren't uncommon in this line of work. Steve figured it would take one whiff of gasoline and human sweat and move along, but the bear lingered, circling the base of the tree. Steve tightened his grip on a thick branch, his senses suddenly sharpening. The bear wasn't just passing through, Steve was sure of it. It was watching him. The chainsaw buzzed in his hands, the blade slicing effortlessly through a thick limb. He kept working, hoping the noise would drive the animal off. The vibrations traveled through the tree, shaking the trunk. Still, the bear stayed. It moved slowly, its black eyes locked onto him as if weighing a decision. It reared onto its hind legs. A bolt of unease shot through Steve's body. Bears were talented climbers, and this one was reaching, testing the bark with its claws. A second later, it started climbing. Steve's pulse hammered. He knew he was in trouble. The higher branches wouldn't support his weight, and the bear was strong, its thick claws sinking effortlessly into the trunk. Steve moved fast, pushing upward, searching for anything to give him a better hold. His safety harness restricted his movement, slowing him down. He heard the deep huff of the bear below. The tree was trembling under the bear's weight, and then claws slashed at his boots. Steve kicked out desperately, but the bear kept climbing. Its teeth snapped inches from his leg, tearing into fabric. Adrenaline surged through Steve's veins as he swung the chainsaw around. He revved the engine, the high-pitched roar cutting through the air. He angled it downward, hoping the sound would send the bear scrambling back down, but it didn't. The bear lunged. A massive paw struck his arm, knocking the chainsaw from his grip. The heavy tool tumbled through the branches, bouncing off the trunk before crashing into the undergrowth below. Steve barely had time to react before the bear struck again. The impact jarred his grip loose. His fingers slipped from the rough bark. His harness twisted as he lost his balance. Then he fell some 15 feet down. His body twisted midair before he slammed into the ground with bone-jarring force. The wind was knocked from his lungs. Pain exploded through his back and ribs. Stars danced across his vision. He tried to move, but it was no use. The bear followed suit, climbing down with astonishing speed. Steve gasped as its claws sliced his back open. Teeth clamped onto his shoulder, puncturing through his jacket, through skin, through muscle. He could feel the pain and the pressure, but the sensations were muted, lost into the damage caused by the fall. He only half heard a sudden burst of noise. The bear flinched. His co-workers were shouting, Steve realized. The bear released him. Dazed, Steve rolled onto his side, gasping for air, his vision swimming. The bear backed away, its head snapping toward the source of the commotion. One of his co-workers, a burly man in an orange vest, was waving a metal toolbox over his head, slamming it against the side of the logging truck. Others had joined in, stomping, shouting, making as much noise as possible. The bear disappeared back into the forest. Steve lay still, his body trembling. He tried to sit up but collapsed back against the dirt. Blood seeped from his wounds, staining the earth beneath him. Footsteps pounded toward him. Hands gripped his shoulders, voices calling his name. The world tilted, faces blurring in and out of focus. Someone pressed a jacket against his wounds, trying to slow the bleeding. A siren wailed in the distance. His co-workers spoke in hushed, anxious voices. They urged him to stay awake. The paramedics arrived minutes later, moving fast, checking his vitals and stabilizing him. They loaded him onto a stretcher, their voices calm but firm. He was alive, but barely. As they carried him toward the ambulance, Steve tilted his head slightly, looking toward the tree he had fallen from. The chainsaw still lay in the undergrowth, forgotten. Steve was rushed to the hospital, where he made a full recovery. It was a miracle. He survived a bear attack and a 15-foot fall. Even more, Steve managed to return to work. But for the rest of his life, whenever he climbed, heard the hum of a chainsaw, and stood among the trees, he would remember the feeling of being hunted. It was a stormy night in July 2024. The air was thick with the scent of rain and damp earth, the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the vast, untamed wilderness of a national park in south-central Alaska. The storm had built slowly throughout the evening, dark clouds gathering over the jagged peaks, smothering the last traces of daylight. Jessica Ward, a seasoned solo camper at 36, had known the weather could turn violent. Still, she had set up her camp carefully, confident in her ability to endure whatever nature threw at her. Her tent, tucked into a small clearing between towering spruce trees, had held against the wind for most of the night. The rain hammered the fabric in steady sheets, pooling in the creases. The wind howled through the trees, shaking branches and tearing through the undergrowth. The temperature had dropped. Without warning, the gusts strengthened, a sudden burst of force ripping through the clearing. The thin aluminum poles buckled. The tent's fabric caved inward, pressing against Jessica's body before snapping loose. The tent crumpled around her, the walls collapsing, trapping her in tangled nylon. Jessica fought to push herself free, cursing under her breath as the wind clawed at her exposed skin. Cold raindrops struck her face, soaking through her jacket. She needed to reset the stakes, reinforce the poles, and ride out the storm. But she sensed a heavy presence when she stepped into the open. Her pulse spiked. The storm had masked the sound of its approach, but now she saw it. Broad shoulders, dark fur matted with rain, eyes reflecting dull light. A grizzly bear, massive and close, its breath visible in the cold air. Neither of them moved, Jessica because she was terrified, the bear because it was sizing her up. Suddenly, the bear decided she wasn't much of a threat. It charged. The sheer force of the impact slammed into Jessica's chest, knocking her off her feet. Her body hit the wet ground hard, the breath forced from her lungs in a single, painful gasp. Clawed paws pressed down on her ribs, pinning her as the bear's weight crushed against her. The musky stench of wet fur filled her nostrils, mingling with the metallic scent of her blood as the first searing pain erupted from her shoulder. The bear's teeth sank deep, puncturing her flesh and ripping through her muscles. The woman screamed, her body convulsing under the agony, but the wind and rain drowned the sound. The bear's jaws clamped harder, shaking her. But Jessica was a fighter. Her survival instincts kicked in. Trembling and slick with rain, her hand fumbled at her belt, searching for the bear spray. The small canister, her last defense, was still there. She forced her shaking fingers to grip it, wrenching it free, angling it blindly toward the bear's face. She pressed the trigger. The chemical spray erupted in a sharp burst, misting into the storm. The bear recoiled, releasing her, its massive head jerking back as it inhaled the burning cloud. It shook its head violently. Jessica didn't hesitate. She rolled onto her side, dragging herself through the mud, despite her body screaming in protest. Blood poured from her shoulder, soaking into her clothes, and her left arm was nearly useless. The pain was excruciating, but she had no time to acknowledge it. She needed distance. Through the haze of rain and her blurred vision, she saw the animal recover. It huffed, claws raking the earth, rage overriding discomfort. It lunged again. She tried to crawl faster, her legs slipping in the mud. The bear swiped, claws raking her calf, tearing fabric, flesh. She collapsed, her face hitting the wet ground, pain radiating through her entire body. She was losing. Suddenly, the bear's head snapped up, ears swiveling. Jessica didn't wait to see what had drawn its attention. Gritting her teeth against the pain, she clawed forward, dragging herself toward the only thing that might save her, her bear-proof food container. It was bolted to the ground, reinforced steel, and there was a small gap between it and the nearest tree. It wasn't a shelter, but maybe it would become a barrier. Each movement sent fire through her wounds. Blood loss made her dizzy, the world tilting violently as she forced herself forward, inch by inch. Her fingers slipped against the cold metal, her breath ragged and uneven. The bear turned back toward her, hesitating for only a second before charging again. Jessica threw herself behind the container, pressing against the hard steel, making herself small, invisible. The bear reached her in seconds, its massive body colliding with the container's side. It sniffed, its claws scraping the surface. She held her breath. The bear paced, circling, its frustration evident in every heavy step. It growled low, guttural, the sound vibrating in her bones. Her head swam, exhaustion pressing in, threatening to pull her under. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the bear stopped. Then, with one final huff, it turned and disappeared into the forest. Jessica didn't move. She couldn't. Her body was broken and her vision was dimming. She fought against the pull of shock, struggling to stay conscious. She didn't know how much time had passed before she heard real and human footsteps. She was lifted, carried, her body weightless in their grasp. Pain threatened to consume her, but she clung to one thought. She was alive. They found her tent shredded, and blood covered the ground where she had fallen. The storm had masked everything. The sounds, the warnings, the moment the bear first entered the clearing. Later, experts would say the bear was starving. The berry crop had failed, leaving it desperate and aggressive. They would say the storm had disoriented it, sending it stumbling into her camp. Jessica knew only that she had come face to face with raw, untamed power, with something stronger, faster, and relentless. She had fought and survived, but she would never forget the feeling of those jaws closing around her body, the weight of something that didn't see her as a person, but only as prey. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the winding expanse of Highway 395 as it cut through the rugged landscapes near a national park in the southern Sierra Nevada, east of Visalia, California. The Davis family, John, Linda, and their two children, 12-year-old Caroline and 8-year-old Robert, were making their way home after a week-long road trip through California's national parks, their SUV packed with camping gear, half-eaten snacks, and the lingering scent of pine and campfire smoke. The trip had been everything they had hoped for: breathtaking views, quiet hikes beneath towering sequoias, and memories that could only be made under star-strewn skies. As they rounded a bend, the road stretched before them, empty save for a single dark shape moving along the shoulder. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow against the golden light of dusk, but as they drew closer, it took form. It was a black bear, its thick fur rippling as it ambled across the gravel, nose twitching as it searched for scraps. Sitting in the front passenger seat, Linda instinctively reached for her phone, eager to capture the moment and share it with her friends online. Caroline and Robert pressed their faces against the glass, their voices rising excitedly. Ever the cautious driver, John slowed to a near stop, his hands firm on the wheel as he kept a wary eye on the animal. He had read enough warnings to know that bears along the highway had become bolder in recent years, drawn to roadside litter and the scent of food left behind by passing travelers. The bear paused, lifting its head. For a heartbeat, it stood motionless, its powerful body rigid with an intensity that sent a faint ripple of unease through the air. Then, without warning, it started running toward them. The sudden burst of movement was shocking. Its paws slammed against the side of the SUV, the impact rocking the vehicle as Caroline and Robert shrieked in terror. Clawed feet scraped against metal, the sound grating and sharp, followed by the dull thud of its massive weight pressing against the doors. Linda barely had time to react before a shadow loomed at her window, her pulse spiking as she realized, too late, that it was partially opened. Thick, curved claws hooked around her arm, rough pads pressing against her skin as a sudden inhuman force yanked her forward. She was pulled, her body twisting painfully. A scream tore from her throat as she clung to the edge of the door, her fingernails scraping against metal, but the bear was relentless. Its strength far beyond anything she could resist. The pressure on her arm was unbearable, muscles straining, tendons burning, skin tearing beneath the brutal grip. John reacted without hesitation. His mind, a blur of panic and desperation, seized on the nearest weapon within reach, the tire iron tucked beneath the driver's seat. His hands closed around the cold metal, his knuckles white as he tore it free and swung with all the force he could muster. The iron struck the bear's shoulder with a dull, sickening thud, but it barely flinched. Linda's body lurched further out of the vehicle, her shoulder twisting at an unnatural angle as she let out another cry of pain. John swung again. This time the blow landed higher, cracking against the side of the bear's skull. A deep, guttural snarl erupted from its throat, a sound raw with anger and pain. It released Linda just long enough for her to collapse back into the car, her arm hanging limp, blood trickling from deep, jagged wounds. But the bear wasn't finished. It reared onto its hind legs, its massive frame towering over the SUV as it slammed its paws onto the hood, denting the metal with the sheer force of its weight. The front windshield splintered, fine cracks spreading like a spider's web across the glass. Inside, the children sobbed, their bodies pressed as far back into their seats as they could go, their small hands gripping each other in blind terror. John threw the car into reverse, tires screeching against the pavement as he fought to distance them from the frenzied animal. The SUV lurched backward, but the bear wasn't letting go so easily. It dropped to all fours, muscles bunching as it prepared to lunge again. Then suddenly, it stopped. For a moment it stood there, breathing heavily, its sides heaving with exertion. Then, just as quickly as it had attacked, it turned away, retreating toward the trees with slow, deliberate steps. John didn't wait to question why. He hit the gas, the SUV lurching forward, tires spinning as they sped down the highway, leaving the bear behind in the fading light. Linda cradled her injured arm against her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her face pale from shock and blood loss. The children's cries filled the cabin, their voices trembling with fear and disbelief. By the time they reached the nearest hospital, Linda was barely conscious, her body shaking from the rapid loss of blood. The doctors worked quickly, stabilizing her, stitching the deep lacerations, setting the bones that had fractured under the bear's brutal grip. Hours later, when she woke, she found John sitting beside her, his face etched with exhaustion and guilt. Their children curled up in chairs at the foot of the bed, too afraid to let her out of their sight. In the days that followed, wildlife officials tracked the bear, analyzed the scene, and tried to determine what had driven it to attack so aggressively. The conclusion was grim but unsurprising: food scarcity. The past season had been unkind to the bears in the region, with drought conditions limiting their access to natural resources, forcing them closer to human territory, and making them more desperate and dangerous. Linda would recover, though the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. And though time would dull the sharp edges of their fear, the Davis family would never again look at the wilderness with the same awe-struck wonder. They had seen the thin line between beauty and brutality, between the wild and the world they thought they understood, and they would never forget how quickly that line could shatter. A lingering bite of winter was in the morning air on March 12, 2024. The ground was still crusted with frost despite the creeping signs of spring. Henry Miller had spent his entire life working this land, rising before dawn each day to tend to his cattle, his body long accustomed to the demands of farm life. At 57, his hands were rough with years of labor, his back slightly stooped from countless hours spent hauling feed and repairing fences. The land stretched wide and unforgiving around him, the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow. It was a harsh place, but it was the only home he had ever known. Henry moved efficiently, loading fresh hay into the troughs, the rhythmic clatter of feed filling the quiet of the early morning. The cows stirred sluggishly, their breath visible in the cold air as they nudged closer, their heavy bodies shifting lazily. Henry had just begun securing the barn doors when something made him pause. A strange stillness had settled over the land, an unnatural silence that sent an uneasy ripple through his gut. Not long after, he saw a grizzly bear emerging from the tree line at the edge of his property. Henry had encountered bears before, had seen them prowling the distant ridges or scavenging along the riverbanks. Still, they never strayed this close. Not this early in the season, not with this deliberate, unsettling boldness. Something was wrong. The bear moved slowly at first, its thick fur matted, its ribs faintly visible beneath its hide. Its breath came in heavy puffs as it sniffed the air, its black eyes locking onto Henry with a hunger that made his stomach tighten. It should have turned away and been deterred by the sight of a human, but it kept coming, its massive paws pressing into the frozen earth. Henry knew better than to run, knew that sudden movement could trigger a chase, but he also knew he couldn't stand there and wait for the inevitable. He needed to secure the animals before the bear decided to close the distance. He took a careful step back, trying to appear unthreatening. But the second he moved, the bear reacted. Without warning, it surged forward. Henry tried to turn, but before he knew it, the animal was on him, knocking him off his feet with a force that sent him sprawling into the dirt. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, his vision blurring as he scrambled to push himself up. But the bear was already there, looming over him, its massive claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. The first blow struck his shoulder, searing pain ripping through him as his coat shredded beneath the force of the claws. The second came a heartbeat later, a brutal swipe across his chest that sent blood spraying across the frozen ground. Henry gasped, his body screaming in agony. But survival instincts kicked in, forcing him to fight through the pain. He twisted, kicking out mindlessly, his boot connecting with the bear's snout, which only enraged the animal further. The bear reared up, its teeth flashing as it lunged again. Henry raised his arms in a desperate attempt to shield himself, but the bear's jaws closed around his forearm, crushing bone with terrifying ease. A scream tore from his throat, echoing across the land, but he wasn't sure there was anyone close enough to hear. Blood soaked his clothes, hot and sticky, his vision darkening at the edges as the bear tore at him, its claws raking across his ribs, its weight pressing him into the earth. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, his strength fading with every passing second. Somewhere in the haze of pain, he became dimly aware of voices, shouts carried by the wind, distant but growing closer. The bear heard the sounds too, and it took a step back. The brief pause allowed Henry to drag himself toward the barn, but his body refused to obey. He was too weak, too broken. The bear turned toward the approaching sounds, its posture shifting, muscles tensing as if weighing the threat. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, it spun and bolted, disappearing into the trees with the same unnatural speed it had arrived with. Henry lay motionless, his breath shallow, his body trembling as he stared at the sky, the world tilting and fading around him. By the time the workers reached him, he was barely clinging to consciousness. Rough hands lifted him, voices urgent, panicked, calling his name, but he could barely respond. The pain was everywhere, drowning him, pulling him under. The last thing he remembered before everything went black was the sound of the hollow and endless wind sweeping across the land. The hospital was nearly an hour away, and though the paramedics fought to keep him stable, his injuries were too severe. His body had endured too much blood lost, too much damage inflicted by claws and teeth meant to tear through flesh with merciless efficiency. By the time the helicopter touched down, Henry Miller was gone. News of his death spread quickly through the small Wyoming town, sending shockwaves through the community. People spoke of the attack in uneasy tones, struggling to reconcile the brutal reality of what had happened with the quiet, dependable man they had known. The land he had worked his entire life, the land he had loved, had become where he met his end. Wildlife officials tracked the bear the following days, scouring the dense forests and rugged terrain for any sign of the rogue predator. When they finally located it, miles from Henry's farm, it was emaciated, its body worn thin from the harsh winter, and its desperation turning it into a killer. It had no choice. Hunger had driven it past the point of fear, the boundaries of instinct, and the invisible line that had once separated the wild from the world of men. The bear was put down, its body taken for study, its death bringing a cold, hollow kind of closure. But for those who had known Henry Miller, it changed nothing. His absence was a wound that would never truly heal, a reminder of the unforgiving nature of the land they called home.